terrific. Thank you very much. I've actually had a chat with the room already. So we're all friends now. And Yvonne just made this lovely comment that in a good interdisciplinary world, people don't know where your home departments are. And I think that that's great. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about mine. So I'm a cognitive scientist. I work in a psychology department. But for a long time, I have found that my colleagues in engineering and design are doing very, very cool things. And I also live in a very tiny country where collaboration is fairly easy, although we don't have this beautiful interdisciplinary center. We'd like one, so I'll talk to you about how all of that went. What I'm going to do today is sort of share a little bit with you about my VR journey. So I'm traditionally an emotion researcher. So my basic goal is to understand emotional states and how emotional states affect cognitive processes like attention and perception and decision-making and memory. I think emotions are a tremendously important part of our cognitive system. So I actually don't draw the line between cognition and emotion. It's just a different type of cognition. And for a long time, emotion researchers in the cognitive sciences have used this paradigm where we show people pictures of emotional things and we measure their responses to them. So do they remember them? Do they attend to them? We might do eye tracking, we might do EEG. And so we might do something where now this is working. Wait. Got it. And now I'm here. There we go. So we show all sorts of pretty pictures, disturbing pictures, disgusting pictures, frightening pictures, things like that. Often we also, because we like a lot of tight experimental control, we do so in these really controlled laboratory environments. So we have a participant here. You can see there's a little display on the screen. It's in a chin rest because we want to keep their fixation focused so that we can measure things like attention. And in other experiments, we might also have them wired up to EEG, which means they also can't move their eyes. And so you've created this really, really constrained environment in which we look at how people respond to pictures of emotional things. Not just pictures, sometimes faces, sometimes words, sometimes we listen to voices. And after a while, we learned things doing this, and that was great. But after a while, it became really, really dissatisfying for a number of reasons. And that's because emotions are not the same thing as the value that's inherent in a stimulus. So we talked about emotional stimuli, but that's not an emotional state. And it's the emotional state that I want to know about. So what we know about those pictures is people do have emotional responses to them, but they're very weak. In terms of the types of emotional responses. Pictures of spiders, even for spider phobics, are not terrifying. But also, emotions are more than just what we think about the thing that we're looking about. So we have our subjective, that's not going to work. Okay, never mind. We have our subjective experience of how we feel. And how we might label it, how it is that we feel, but emotions also are about the activation of a physiological state that's most adaptive for whatever the situation is, right? We have emotions when there's a challenge or an opportunity in our environment of some sort, and they help us guide our behavior. So they activate the right sort of physiology to help you achieve that thing, and they prime a whole bunch of behaviors. So we become, when we're angry, our fists clench in anticipation of physical violence, perhaps. We approach or withdraw. We come toward things. We move away from things. We look away from things. So we prime these behaviors that are the adaptive part of what an emotion is for. And so if we've got our participants tethered to and immobile, we're really not allowing them to express anything in the range of what we would call normal emotional states, even if they were actually frightened or enjoying the emotional pictures we sent them. So one day, I was having a chat with a colleague, and she's in film studies, and she was doing work on VR in cinema. So working actually with Weta, and so in Wellington, the Weta studios are in Wellington that made Lord of the Rings and all those things. So they do a lot of really cool film development stuff. And so she was working on, can we develop compelling VR cinema? And so I was in her office and she said, try this. And she has in her office a plank on the floor, and she just had, was an Oculus headset. And she has this very commercial product, Richie's Plank Experience. And I know Mark and I have already talked, I'm sure most of you have done the plank, but if you haven't, the really quick thing about what happens is you enter VR, very cartoony looking, there's nothing photorealistic about it. You're walking, you look around city street, you can hear the birds. You turn around, you get into an elevator. And when you're in the elevator, you reach out and you push the button that says plank. And when you do, the elevator doors close and there's elevator music and time passes and you can see through the little crack in the door that you're rising. And when the doors open, so I get it even just looking at this. You're 80 stories up. And the first time I did this, I was so terrified. It took me 2 minutes before I was able to just put my foot out onto the plank. And I thought, this is how we have to study an emotion like fear. People are afraid. I am afraid. I see a few weird people that manage to go, oh yeah, okay, and dissociate themselves from what it is that they're feeling. But heights, depth perception is a really primal visual sense, and so it's really hard to turn that off, and that screaming at you that you are in danger. So I thought, this is why we want to do this. But not just because we can create these authentic emotional experiences. We are just entirely different than anything we can do with pictures or even film. Because we can also maintain rigorous experimental control, right? So, I mean, I could put spiders in the room and see what happens to people, but now I can't control the situation. So as an experimentalist, I want that full, rigorous experimental control. I can also allow wide range of behavioral responses. Now it doesn't matter that my participants can move around. Now it's great that my participants can move around. And now I can assess cognition during these emotional experiences. And that's really what we want to know. We want to know what happens when, you're in a fire and you're terrified and you're trying to find the exit. We want to be able to look at your behavior in that situation, not after that situation. So the paradigms we used to use would be, you show people a bunch of nasty images, and then you look at what happens to their attention. So all of these things are benefits that are really changing just the way you can do psychological research. But also you can track everything. So we get these beautiful multivariate data sets. We can track people's self-reports, what they say, but we can also track their physiology. We can track their movements, including their eye movements, as well as their body movements. And we can record EEG responses. So, and you all know this, but as an emotion researcher, this is so exciting that we can actually now have this, not without giving up the control that we love so much in experimental settings, to have these really rich environments in which we can ask questions. So, little cartoony thing, just explaining. So we use room scale VR. Our participants are always walking around. And we also record wirelessly physiological responses. So they get a little belt, and it can record skin conductance, skin temperature, heart rate. So ECG can also record EMG if you can add a whole bunch of electrodes to it, and it's wireless. So the first study we did was not wireless, and our poor students had to move around with a cart with all the physio equipment on because the people were cabled. So it's really exciting that things are happening, making this so easy these days. Okay. So what I'm going to do is walk you through a series of experiments that we've done using this plank to see what are the types of questions about emotion that we can answer using this methodology. But I will say toward the end, in my lab, we've been working as well on disgust, the dirty bathroom that people walk around in, and there's squishy, wet carpet, and they're barefoot, and it's pretty disgusting. And then we've also been working on because we don't always do things that are nasty, we're working on the experience of awe. So people in great big vast expansive environments undersea or in space, where we're looking at the power of awe to reduce stress, increase resilience, create empathy for the environment, things like that. So I'm happy to, I'm not going to talk about those in this talk, but I'm happy to chat about them afterwards as well. So the first thing we want to know is, can we actually induce authentic emotional responses using all parts of that emotion, or are people just acting afraid, right? It's a game, it's fun. Everyone knows it's not really real, right? So is it an authentic emotional response? So what we did was we created our own version of Ritchie's plank so that we can actually manipulate things. So participants enter and they're on the curb. And then we're going to measure their subjective response as a rating of a whole bunch of emotions. And then we use sort of a 30-second epoch in each environment, and that's where we're going to pick up skin conductance and heart rate. And we're also going to be tracking motion in these. So these are the key time points, and I'm going to use these over and over again. So I'll just take a minute and walk us through it. And so then they're at the bottom of the elevator, and then in our height condition, they go up the elevator, the door opens, then, and we do another set of ratings. They take their first step onto the plank. We do another set of ratings, and then they walk sometimes to the end of the plank. Not everyone makes it to the end of the plank, but because maybe this is all just because of plank walking, we also have a control condition where people get in the elevator, it goes halfway up, comes back down, elevator opens and the plank is on the ground. So they're still doing exactly the same motions, experiencing a very similar visual environment, trying to walk on this plank, but they have none of the height cues in the control condition. So, and we're going to ask them to rate their fear, anxiety, anger, sadness, happiness, disgust, excitement, and then also presence. I'll talk about presence in the next study. So just taking a look at our subjective data. So again, I'll take a minute here and walk you through these graphs because there's a bunch of them that are all very similar. So we have our 5 time points here: the curb, bottom of the elevator, elevator door opens, but they're still inside, stepping onto the plank, and at the end of the plank. And then these are their fear ratings from 1 to 10. Our control condition doesn't really get afraid. And that's our height condition. And, you know, I'm as a psychological scientist, we never get effects that are that big. So like, who needs stats, essentially, but we did them anyway. It's a really big, compelling effect. We look at skin conductance across the same time points. There's our control condition. There's our height condition. We take a look at heart rate. So these are beats per minute. There's our control condition. There's our height condition. And then finally, we're going to look at the amount of time they take to walk the plank. So this is not very sophisticated motion tracking. This is by eye on the video. How long did it take them to take the first step? And then how long did it take them to walk to the end? I know there's much more we could do with this motion data, and we just haven't found the right PhD student to want to work with it yet. But you can see in the height condition, it takes them more than twice as long. It's taking them more than 10 seconds to step out onto the plank. And that's the amount of time additional time to walk to the end of the plank. So we're seeing really, really big subjective, physiological, and behavioral responses. So our answer to our first question was, it looks like fear, right? So I mentioned presence. So another thing that we measured was presence. This is Chris Mayman. Chris was a postdoc in my lab. He's now a lecturer in my department and is my collaborator on all of these projects. So he can make all the magic happen. So he has a background in cognitive science and theory of mind, but he can also make all the magic happen, and he talks engineer as well. So he was sort of our first interdisciplinary person to work with. And he was very interested in this phenomenon of presence because we tend to talk about presence as being a thing that only happens in VR. But presence, of course, happens in the real world as well. It's a psychological state of mind, of feeling like you are in a particular reality, that you are part of an environment. So, and if you think about the real world, you can be more and less present in the real world, right? Like we dream, that's an obvious example where you can be present somewhere else. It feels like you're present there. But we also mind wander, and we know there's all sorts of substances that can change that sense of presence. So, but presence is really hard to study because as soon as you ask people, do you feel present? They go, yeah. But in VR, we're kind of comfortable with the idea that maybe we're not present, or maybe we are present. So now we can actually get some sense of the variability. And we're inspired a little bit by Anil Seth, who is a cognitive scientist, who talks a lot about the relationship between the body and consciousness. And he has this predictive coding model, which I'm not largely going to get into, but the idea that essentially what our brain is always doing is looking for mismatches between what we expect to happen and what the actual sensory input is coming in. And when we have a very good match between those two things, we feel very present. And when we don't have a good match between those two things, we don't feel present. So it's more complicated and it's all got models, but that's the gist of it. And so on the basis of this, you would think that you're in a situation where you're walking on some sort of plank, you're in a virtual environment, that you would feel more present if your body was responding in a way that you would expect it to be responding given the environment that it is in, and that you would feel less present if you weren't having this response. And this is consistent with some other research that VR people have been doing, showing that there's this strong relationship between strong emotions and presence. We feel more present when we are in emotional environments. And this is true in the real world as well. So if you think about like the jolt you get, if you've ever been on the highway, this is the one I think about a lot. If you've ever been on the highway and you're starting to fall asleep and you just sort of, and you suddenly realize and you jolt awake, and it's sort of this intense level of presence of coming back into your environment because and it comes with a really big, strong jolt of fear. So we also asked people to rate their presence on the plank. So here we have our control condition. Presence is not bad in this little cartoony environment. So it's around 6 to 7 out of 10. But this is what happens in the height condition. It's the same virtual environment. They're walking on the same plank, but they feel more present in the environment. We took a look at some correlations. So we see that presence is actually strongly related to the subjective feeling with fear, how much fear people were feeling, but not at all related to heart rate or skin conductance. We were very surprised about this. We thought that if your heart was pounding, that's what the signal would be to you that this must be real. But it turns out there's so much variability in individuals' physiological responses that this is the thing that's really driving it. Heart rate and skin conductance are correlated, which is reassuring, so they should be. So it tells us we're measuring them reasonably well. So then what Chris did was he took the step of the model would say that this relationship between being up high and feeling present, in fact, would be mediated by fear. That it's because being up high makes you afraid is why you feel more present. So he tested a causal model. So we took the experimental effect of height, which predicts the presence that people feel on the plank. You can see that in the graph. But if you do a mediational model, what you find is that height exposure is correlated with subjective fear is correlated with presence in the plank. And when you put this, put change in subjective fear into the model, the relationship between height and presence goes away. So it's impossible to test this as a fully causal model using this technique, but it's really consistent with the fact that fear, the feeling of fear, is what is making people feel present in this environment. So we say, so our conclusion here is that subjective fear mediates changes in presence. And I love this quote by novelist Tim O'Brien, which is that you're never more alive than when you're almost dead. So this is something that, writers have known for a long time, actually, that our emotions are a big part of presence. But what VR, I think, does is allow us to now start to test some of those relationships because people are willing to accept that they're more and less present. Whereas in the physical world, people think it's weird when you ask them, how present are you? And the mere act of asking them makes them feel like they're not, that they are all of a sudden. All right, so we've got subjective, physiological, and behavioral aspects of emotions, but all of those, of course, are driven by neural changes, right? So the brain is in charge of everything. So can we also use VR as a way to study those neural responses that are generating fear? So this is work that I did in collaboration with colleagues. They were then at Ruhr University in Bochum, Sebastian Aucklenberg and his student Yasmin. And what they did is they tested the affective, so same plank simulation we sent to them, and they had people walk the plank, but they did so in EEG. And what they were looking for is changes in the activation of prefrontal cortex. So there are hemispheric differences between left and right prefrontal cortex. This is the part of the talk that is for Chris McManus, who I see is online. So the people talk about left brains and right brains and hemispheric asymmetries and this sort of idea about our logical left brain and our creative right brain, and it's all hogwash. But there are, in fact, differences, important differences between the left and the right hemisphere. Left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, receives sensation from the right side of the body, processes information at the right side of space. But there are also differences in the way they handle visual information, the way they handle auditory information, and the way they handle emotional information. So if we look at activity in prefrontal cortex, greater left than right activity is associated with positive emotions or with approach-related emotional states. So things that are positive tend to be approach-related, whereas greater right than left is associated with negative emotions or defensive withdrawal types of states. And a lot of this literature comes from studies of people with depression who show a shift toward greater right than left in association with feeling depressed. But it's really hard to see these shifts happening in real time in laboratory environments because you measure EEG when people are tethered to equipment and you're showing them pictures. So really hard to do EEG with real emotional states. Except that now you can do this. So this, it doesn't look comfortable. This was also during COVID. So this poor participant is both masked, but this is a mobile EEG system. It's got a whole bunch of onboard filters that deals with all the VR noise and produces pretty good EEG data. And so what they did was had participants walk the plank up high and down low. They also did another condition where they looked at a bunch of emotional images to see what would happen with that. There's a bunch of things that happen in this study, but I'm going to walk you through the most important one for our purposes. So here we have on the y-axis what we call frontal asymmetry, which is, it's just a relative alpha power in left versus right prefrontal cortex. Really simple metric. Down below is greater right than left, up above is greater left than right. And you see on the low plank, there's no real, so this is when the elevator door opens, this is after the first step onto the plank, and this is at the end of the plank. There's nothing with the emotional images, no changes at all. No changes significantly with the low plank, but with the high plank, what we see is a consistent rightward shift over time. So as people are becoming more and more, we know that the fear ratings are also going up as people go further and further along the plank. We're seeing this rightward shift in frontal asymmetry. So this is, it's a really crude metric of an emotion. And more what it is an indicator to us that we can actually measure EEG signals while people are up and moving around in these sort of virtual environments. All right, so yes, but we don't observe these changes with the images, which gives us a sense as well that we're able to capture something that these emotional image paradigms aren't doing. So then we thought, so remember, so I haven't talked a little bit in a bit about the motion data. And we saw that there were big differences between people where the plank was high versus the plank was low. This is my colleague Matt Crawford, who's a social psychologist. And he was interested in this idea about people being able to recognize other people's emotions. So some of you will know there's a huge debate in the emotion field about whether, for example, your phone will ever be able to recognize your emotions, whether emotional displays are indicative of emotional states. Certainly for facial expressions, not. Facial expressions are too variable. There's lots of situations in which the facial expression is not the stereotypical facial expression for an emotion. But what about the body? Does the body, we might be able to lie with our face, can we lie with our body? People who have done this sort of thing previously tend to use actors and ask them to walk like you're afraid, walk like you're angry, and do things like that. Whereas we have data of people walking while they are afraid. So what we did was just use the camera data. Again, this is a few years ago, so I know the tech is nicer now, but I'm just going to show you a few seconds of it. It's almost painful to watch. So this is just using the headset, the 2 hand trackers that they're holding, and we put 2 foot trackers on them as well. And then this is Breckle, and it then generates an avatar that reflects the movements of the person. And yeah, it's painful to watch, so I'll stop. So if I were to ask you, is that person walking on the plank at height or on the ground? I'm guessing you would not have a hard time doing this. So what we did was we actually didn't use the whole videos. What we then did was made these little 20-second minimal light displays. So you might have seen these studies of body motion where you put little infrareds on just a few joints. People are tremendously good at sensing biological motion. So we've got just the headset and these sets of trackers. And then we showed them to naive participants. And we said, here's some video of people, and they are walking on a balance beam. And the balance beam is either up high or low. And we just want you to guess. So they just watch a bunch of these videos, and we say, can you guess which they are? So there's actually 3 experiments. One where they had to say, is the balance beam high or low? And then another set of participants, we said, instead of that, we asked them to say, if you were to say how afraid you think this person is, what is your rating on a scale of 1 to 10? In study 2, we did the high-low again, we did the fear rating, and then we thought, okay, well, maybe it's not fair because we're telling them it's fear and asking them to rate fear. So we just said, spontaneously, what emotion do you think, another group of people, spontaneously, what emotion do you think these people are displaying or feeling? And then study 3, we asked for fear ratings. And then we said, what information are you using to help you make this judgment? Turns out people have no idea what the information is they're using to make the judgment, but they're phenomenally good at it. And I think this is because it's such an intense emotional response. I think lots of subtle emotions would not show this effect. So this is reported fear of the participant who was walking on the plank when they were doing it. And this is the perceived fear of these naive participants just watching the videos. And what we see is across study 1, study 2, and study 3, correlations of about 0.8. So they can tell who's afraid and who's not afraid. And so this sort of argues against this idea that there's too much variability. And again, I think this might be because the emotional experience is so intense. Not everyone does it. You can see there are some people here who are really not afraid, right? But they also don't look afraid. So there is variability, but people are really interpreting the people who are afraid, they're able to pick them up really well. If we take a look at the spontaneous emotions that people said, just take a wild guess, what emotions do you think? People in the high plank, almost entirely fear, anxiety, cautious, anxious, cautious. Those are the words that come up. These are spontaneously generated by these participants. On the low plank, you don't see much of those at all, but you see curious, excited, confident, calm, sad. They're all kind of all over the place. And none of them are particularly emotional. So yeah, people seem to be able to recognize this as fear in the spontaneous movements of others. So this is going to be the last experiment that I'm going to talk about. So now we're going to bring it to another question about emotion. So now finally I'm convinced it works. Can we start to answer some interesting questions about emotion? So Chris is the lead on this particular study, looking at whether people can use emotion regulation strategies in this really intense environment. So one of the things we always say when we ask for money to do this type of research is that we suggest that by understanding how people can, these virtual environments may provide good ways to train people in emotion regulation, right? So if you're a therapist and you want to train people to do emotion regulation, you often have to say, okay, now imagine you're having an argument with the boyfriend. What are you going to do? In VR, we can actually put people into the environments and then coach them through these emotion regulation strategies. So we always say there's this potential for therapeutic benefit. And that builds on a lot of stuff using VR exposure therapy that's been shown to be pretty effective. But just looking at it in a broader range, now that we can do all sorts of really different VR scenarios, we can extend the range of things that we could do. So Chris's work is motivated by what's called the process model of emotion regulation. It's probably one of the most prevalent, dominant theories in psychology of emotion regulation, which is, so the idea is that any emotion that we have is really a generative process, right? So it starts out with, we find ourselves in a situation and we pay attention to what's going on around us. So we know that emotional things attract our attention. And then we appraise the situation. Is this good or is this bad? And then our bodies produce this response. So the idea is that an emotion unfolds over time. Even though it might feel really quick to you, if you're one of those people who's quick to anger or that moment of terror, it does actually take time. Everything in your brain takes some time. And what Gross and Thompson argued is that different emotion regulation strategies, if we want to control our emotions, we can do so at different stages along the way. All right. So let's say, I'll go back to the boyfriend example. So I've had a difficult breakup with my boyfriend, and I know I feel really bad whenever I'm around him. And so I might use situation selection, which is I do not go anywhere near him, right? I do not go to an event where he's going to be. So I can just avoid the entire situation. Therapists will say avoidance, not the best strategy in the world, but anyway. Or I could modify the situation. So if I find myself at a party and he's there, I could make sure that I'm talking to a friend. I could make sure I'm talking to a very attractive friend. I can do things to control the situation so that he's not center of my thoughts. Or if that's too late, now I can focus my attention. So I can become really involved in a conversation that I'm having with someone else. So I'm not thinking about what he's doing. I might also alter the amount of attention I have. Alcohol is tremendously good at doing that, very effective. So I am now paying less attention to my boyfriend. But a therapist would say this is the healthy strategy, which is reappraisal. And this is, in fact, the goal of cognitive behavior therapy, is to teach people to find yourself in this situation, but reappraise the situation, right? It really wasn't a great relationship anyway. This is difficult, but I'm moving on, and I'm going to have new opportunities. I'm going to be able to travel. I'm big enough to be happy for him in his life. You know, whatever it is that we do cognitively to change our state, that's reappraisal. And then finally, if that's too late, and now I'm having my full-on emotional response, I can at least look happy. And so I can change my facial expression, or I can change my behavior and act like I'm not at all stressed or upset in this particular environment. People do all of these things, right? But therapists particularly are interested in which of these things are the healthiest things to do in certain situations. And these are argued to be what are called antecedent-focused emotion regulation strategies. These are the things that you do ahead of time to prevent the emotion from getting the best of you. And these out here, it's too late. This is response-focused. A lot of research showing response-focused emotion regulation, really stressful on your body, really not very effective. So in this particular study, what we wanted to do was look at the effectiveness of attention and appraisal. So I'm going back to therapists just for 1 second. The reason that appraisal is thought to be the healthier strategy is that just distracting yourself doesn't solve your problem, right? Your problem is how you're thinking of the situation. Just distracting yourself is not going to solve the problem. As soon as you stop distracting yourself, the problem is going to come back again. But really hard to test some of this model in the lab because hard to create the emotional situations, but not anymore, right? So now we have the plank. So what we do is we worked with a clinical psychologist. We brought people in. We actually trained them in reappraisal. They spent 15 minutes with a clinician talking about what reappraisal is, then said, imagine you found yourself in a situation where you're looking down over a cliff. And so we really primed them for what was going to happen when they were up there on the plank, and then had them talk through good reappraisal strategies. The reappraisal strategy people like to use in VR is it's not real, it's not real, it's not real, right? So we hear people do this all the time. And we wanted to discourage that because that seems to just be taking the presence away from it. And that seems like cheating. That's not something you can do in real life, right? He's not, my boyfriend's not there, he's not there, he's not there, right? So we wanted to encourage them to rethink, you know, what a beautiful opportunity this is to have this experience, you know, different ways that you might appraise the excitement of the situation. In our distraction condition, we've done dozens of these types of experiments. In this particular one, you're standing there on the plank, and we're going to give you, it's kind of like a little video game. It's called a go-no-go task. Cognitive psychologists like to use it all the time to study inhibitory control. So your ability to withhold a response, but really it's just something visual for you to be doing. So what you're going to see is a series of shapes. And you want to play along? Let's play along. So you're going to clap whenever you see a circle or a triangle and not clap when you see a square. Okay, ready? Oh, thank you for the people with failures of inhibitory control. Prove to me that it's a real thing. So we do this very fast, and they've got 2 clickers, and so it feels very video game-like. It's kind of like Space Invaders, I think, kind of thing. We actually have a version of it that is Space Invaders, sort of more interesting than circles and squares, but the idea is that you can feel your brain kind of go, oh, at that moment. And we're actually, in other studies, really interested in what fear does to that. But that's a topic for another discussion. And I don't have a slide that I can tell you what happens in the immersion condition. That's not good. In the immersion condition, what we do is we tell people to please focus on the emotions that you're feeling, sense what's happening in your body, and talk about it out loud to us. So we're asking them to lean in to their emotions. So timeline, they do training, and then we're going to again do our ratings and our measures at the curve at the top. After the step, but before they do the task, the emotion regulation task, this is during the emotion regulation task, and this is at the end of the plank. So these are our fear ratings. So walking, and these are our timelines. We've got immerse, reappraise, and distract. So if we look at our immersion condition, as we would expect, fear goes up. Even after talking about how afraid they are, they become less afraid. And this is something that's also well known. Talking about your feelings is affect labeling. It's kind of good for you. But then when you walk to the plank, at the end of the plank, it comes right back. This is what happens in the reappraised condition. These people were prepared to be reappraising, and they're not really doing any better than the immersion people. And these are the distract people. So the distract people, this process of engaging in distraction is actually a significantly more effective emotion regulation strategy than the reappraisal is. But you can see by the end, it bounces right back again.
Yeah,
Yeah.
at the end, what you mean with the end is that, okay, they reach the end of the plank, but
Yeah.
they also stop.
So they now stop at the end of the plank and we say, okay, one more time, tell us how
So
to they do the ratings again when they get to the end. Yeah. So just having let go of the emotion regulation strategy, now they're walking and it bounces back again. If we take a look at heart rate is, I think, the really interesting thing that's going on. So immersion, we again see this increase, drops a little bit. Now we can actually measure heart rate during the task as well as after the task. And again, it comes back up when they go to the end of the plank. This is what happens with reappraisal. Again, not really helping them much over the immersion. This is what happens with the distraction. And I think there's a couple of cool things that are going on here. So one is this. So these people are showing a big jump in heart rate when they first step out onto the plank, which suggests to us that our emotion and our reappraisal and immersion people are actually having a little bit more preparation for mentally what's coming. Whereas the distraction people are like, woof, oh, look at that. But look what happens during the task. We see this rapid, really, really substantial drop in heart rate. We've now done 6 of these experiments using different types of distraction tasks, and they all show exactly the same effect. But look at the rebound. So afterwards, so it's only the act of being engaged in something else that is really regulating people's emotions. You can't be afraid and play video games at the same time, which there are people actually looking at video games as ways of treating anxiety, or the idea of video game avoidance as a way of avoiding anxiety. So you see this big rebound. Last data slide, skin conductance, not so tidy. We get the jump, drops during the task, rebounds, more of a drop consistent with the heart rate in this cognitive task. So I don't have clear answers on what's going on here, except that people don't seem to be able to use reappraisal all that well in these really intense environments. And this is something that us WellWIC clinicians have said. We teach people to use reappraisal, but in the heat of the moment, it's really hard. Maybe in the heat of the moment, what you need to be doing is something that's more avoidance, and then come back to reappraisal when you have the resources. So even immersion actually seemed to be helping people in terms of their rates dropping. And consistent with sort of some clinical theory, distraction is effective in the short term, but not in the long term. So I'm wrapping up. Other things that are going on in my lab. So that was a whole background of looking at how we can study emotion in these VR environments, looking at sort of that very multifaceted view of emotion and emotional states and how they arise. But a whole other part of my lab is, now that we've got these environments, how does emotion affect attention? So what you're paying attention to while you're up there on the plank or in the disgusting dirty bathroom, looking at inhibitory control, that go, no go, decision making. So there are a lot of people that would argue that really intense emotional experiences reduce our cognitive capacity, right? So we sometimes talk about the deer in the headlights, that idea that under really severe stress, you just don't have the mental capacity and executive control, we would call it, to actually be able to function. Weirdly, for most of these, we're seeing no distraction affects emotion, But we are not seeing effects of the plank on people's ability to do a lot of these things. People are really good at turning it off when they need to, and then it comes right back again when they stop. So this is a surprising thing to us. We're kind of digging, figuring maybe we haven't found the right types of tasks to look at yet. We've been looking, oh, and I was just telling Mark, because I'm keen that you guys are doing some of this as well. We've also been doing things asking ChatGPT to imagine it was on the plank. So we give it a really detailed prompt to say, you're standing here, you see this, to look at its language training base as a way of saying, what is ChatGPT able, I'm not gonna say understand, but pull together about human experience. So a lot of people have argued it's not going to be useful until it has better understanding of human experience. So can it draw on its language base to help it predict what human experience might be? Turns out it does pretty good. It knows that heights are frightening, but it has no variability. So whereas our humans actually show quite a bit of variability, it seems to be capturing the stereotypical human. We also look at discuss. This is not going to show up great on the screen. Sorry. Okay, that's a really dirty bathroom. And there's a toilet there, and in the actual lab, big on topic things. Okay, so we're very big on multisensory work. So there, that's better. That's urgent. So they start in a nice clean room, and then we look at what happens when they move into the dirty room, and then we have them do cognitive tasks in this environment. We work with a VR artist to make things, but in the actual lab, we have a sponge, we put a towel on it, it's wet, and there's a bucket. Oh, it's okay, it'll be fine, I think. And they actually have to reach into a bucket of water when they get to the toilet. Anyway, we have a lot of fun lab meetings with me. Come up with these ideas. These are some of our early awe studies. I don't have slide shots of the more recent ones that are more expansive, but we do things where people are in a spaceship. And so the spaceship is kind of cool, but then when you travel, I think we're going to need light off for this one. When you travel to different environments, you can pull a lever and all the windows open up, and you're either out in space, or you're deep underwater, or you're up on top of mountains. And so these produce subjectively really in people compelling awe experiences. They think the spaceship is cool and really interesting, and they think it's awesome until we show them the expansive, and they're like, oh. And so we can look at the jaw drop. People look up more. So looking at some of those behaviors, and awe is a really interesting emotion. We're trying to learn more about using this. This is a project we're doing in collaboration with our engineering colleagues, using the Nova 8360. This is a ball that spins. And so with 6 degrees of freedom, I'm not an engineer. But you basically wear your headset and you can experience all of the spins. And so we've been creating a flyover. So imagine you're a bird doing a flyover of the New Zealand environment. So we're quite interested in environmental attitudes and behaviors, and whether we might be able to use VR experiences the same way people have argued nature experiences will be the only way that people appreciate nature. Can we do this in other sorts of ways? And we're learning all sorts of cool things about motion at the same time. And this is our last project. And we've been using virtual reality just for virtual field work. So this is a project with our Department of Conservation, and we went to all of these sort of iconic tourist spots on the South Island where you've got mountains and beautiful vistas. And so we filmed it in 360, and then there's a simulation, you drive up to the tourist site and you get out of your car and you walk around, and we say, go take some pictures. And what they wanted to do was test people's reading these signs that say, don't feed the Kia. So the Kia is a native New Zealand parrot. It has this tendency to eat people's food, which is really not good for the parrot. So they're trying to get people not to feed the parrots. And they're like everywhere when you go. And so we did eye tracking of people, put the signs, virtual signs into these environments, and then we were able to do some eye tracking studies for them. And it turns out people don't look at the signs. Which is useful actually, because it means you need different strategies. You cannot, no matter how good your sign is, it's not going to attract people's attention when there's a beautiful bird there. So in my gist of all of that is that through this work I've been doing, bringing sort of my psychological questions, working with engineers at my university who are doing a lot of HCI work and a lot of VR and XR development, with our artists and designers to create things that are compelling environments. That if we want to induce emotions, we need to make them feel real in some sorts of ways. And that by bringing all these things together is how we do things, which is one of the reasons I'm here, because you all seem to do this so very, very well. All right. That's me. I am done. Right.
Are there already some questions? So I have one.
Yeah.
I have looked also at how well these machine learning models predict emotions solely based on eye features, and it didn't work well. You've shown this gait and how
Yeah.
people actually are pretty good at predicting that. And what is your take on what do we need to be able to also teach whatever machine learning technology to actually be able to predict something like that? Or do you think this is more of a human understanding of the others? Or do you think, for example, if we take the gait behavior and would also put that into a machine learning classifier, that would suffice? So what's your take on that?
So with the gait, I think that these are intense emotional experiences. And the gait is such a strong one-to-one marker of fear. And so that I think, because I did not think this was going to happen. And I was like, no, everything is variable. We know you can't facial express, AI is never going to be able to do facial expressions because facial expressions are too variable. There's not a one-to-one mapping between an emotional state and a facial expression unless people are trying to express the emotion they want you to see. And so I thought maybe that was true with gait as well. But I was very surprised. And in fact, I didn't have that up there, but it also correlates with walking time, as you can probably imagine. So a machine learning algorithm would have no problem doing that. It would just use walking time and it would be pretty accurate. But that was a big surprise, and I think it's because it's so stereotypical and the subtlety of an intense emotion and the subtleties of day-to-day emotion is where all of the tremendous variability is. And in that really noisy environment where you've got all this overlap between different emotional states is where context matters hugely. So humans are not perfect at this, but humans are not bad at it either. Some humans are better than others, we know as well. But the more context you remove, the worse humans get. So clearly context is really important for us. You may have seen these beautiful photos of people at Wimbledon winning. And if you just look at the facial, Lisa Feldman Barrett does this work, where if you just look at the facial expressions, they look like they're in agony. And they're just ecstatic, but as soon as we have context, we know it's this combination of joy and relief and triumph and exhaustion, and we can interpret all kinds of things because we use all that context. And so I think it's not impossible for our machine learning, AI algorithms to be able to use context, like to stop trying to look in the moment and look at what's happened over time, possibly might be a way that it could do something like that. But I think it just needs way more data. And we should never rely on it. Just like I think you should never rely on a human to predict what someone else is, to say what someone else is feeling.
Thank you. It's a really fascinating talk. I was just thinking about fear and
Yeah.
how you focused on fear of heights. But I wondered that fear is quite complex. We're frightened of many different things, and horror movies tap into these different types of fears. So we might have fear of being chased, fear of being attacked,
Yeah.
fear of the world falling apart. So I just wondered if
Yeah, existential dread.
all of that.
Yeah.
I wondered whether you thought about how you might look at different kinds of fear. I mean, because the plank lends itself to
Mhm. Yeah.
experiments, and you may have a case for why you use that paradigm. But
Yeah.
I wondered if you thought about how you might look at other types of other kinds of fear.
Yes. So yes, definitely. We talk about this in the lab quite a bit. The plank, I think it's driven by the fact that our depth perceptions, it activates our depth perception system. And, you know, I mean, infants won't crawl over a virtual cliff. So it's a really, really fundamental, and in fact, the people who say they're not afraid and are just regulating, I am convinced, are just able to convince themselves it's not real. And therefore they tend to do a lot of gaming and things like that. So it's a really primal sort of emotional state. But yes, I think some of the others. So one way to do that is to look at people with and without phobias of things might be one way of getting around that. So working with spiders are sort of quite common, or other creepy crawly sorts of things. There are people, there is a haunted house one, but you bring up a really interesting point, which is even the plank. I mean, people download this and do it for fun, all right? And we know it's not real. And so I think about things like people on purpose play gory video games and love the blood and the guts and the gore, and that's part of what's fun about it. The student who's been working with our disgust paradigm took a look at people's whole constellation of emotional responses, and then she also asked people how positive or negative you were feeling. So not what particular emotion, but just in general, how positive or negative. And she found two really distinct types of people. So using a profile analysis, the simulation is very effective. So compared to the clean room, the disgusting room is disgust. Disgust is what they identify it with really quite easily. But there's a small group of people who find that a very negative experience. And there's another group of people who find it a reasonably positive experience. And what we haven't done is had enough of those two groups. So I think this is a really interesting phenomenon. And this idea of mixed emotions, that disgust doesn't always have to be a negative thing. People can seek it out. Sadness, we go to sad movies. We can seek out those emotions. So the is it good or is it bad is different than what is the emotion. And I just feel there's so much opportunity still to use the richness that we can create in these environments to look at some of those mixed emotions. So that same thing, fear and adventure. You know, I've bungee jumped, and I did it as I told myself I can't study fear and not bungee jump. And it's terrifying, but also so exciting and exhilarating. And you know, you're afraid and you do it anyway. But massive amounts of emotion regulation. I'm not gonna die. I'm not gonna die. Yeah.
So you talk about the fact that, you know, there is no one-to-one response, at least for facial expression.
Yeah.
At the same time, the literature on body movement and affect show that affect does not just show, that body movement does not just show how you feel in that moment, but somehow also how you are ready to respond.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you look at how the body movement change in relation, I don't know, to the appraisal task versus the immersion or other,
Yeah.
you know, also in the disgust situation, on how the body change according to how you are ready to, or what the way you are trying to regulate your emotion.
So that is an excellent suggestion, and we just need more data. I think that we end up with people with enough variability in this. So even with the disgust, We didn't have big enough groups, but I am willing to bet the people who are afraid are we have a slowing in the disgust situation, but the people who I would love to see that it's the people who have negative disgust who are the ones that are really, really reluctant to move. And so I think behavior, you're right about the body, is very much about action. And that may be the better way to look at emotions than the face. We can use our face in so many different ways. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
a very quick question online, and then we'll have a very quick, and then we have to stop, unfortunately. But I think you're around for a little longer, right, today. So
Yeah.
we can also take this offline. So maybe we just do the online question briefly by Anya Emmons. Will other emotions give as clear, strong a signal as fear does? Do you think it's more about the intensity of the emotion or its balance, positive and negative?
Yeah. No, I don't think other emotions produce this intensity. Although we haven't looked at sexual arousal. I've heard there's sex in the VR world. But in my own emotion studies, we would use erotic stimuli quite a bit, and they tend to match fear in terms of arousal. And so that may be a way to go if I wanted to fight with my ethics committee and do that. But other emotions are less intense. So our awe emotions, for example, first of all, awe is mixed with a bunch of other things about happiness and calmness. And so it's a much more mixed, complex state. And it also, we're not getting clear physiological signals from it. And even disgust, we thought we would get really good. We're getting clear behavioral and subjective measures of disgust, but the physiology is kind of all over the place. And disgust is kind of an interesting emotion that way. So people, because you get that arousal that you get in the skin conductance, but there's also that sinking, that nausea feeling, which is parasympathetic. So I think the physiologists are there. A lot of emotions are not as clear cut as fear is. So it was a nice one to start with, but I think it's misleading in terms of that simplicity.
All right, thank you very much again.
I think
Just take this offline. So that's so just gonna stop the recording.